The first thing everyone noticed about Marco was his silence. Not the awkward kind, not the rude kind, just the quiet of someone who had learned that listening kept you employed. He drove a black luxury sedan through the streets of Miami every day. Windows tinted, leather seats spotless, suit always pressed. From the outside, he looked like part of the city's wealthy machine. From the inside, he was just a Filipino man trying not to make mistakes. Marco had been a driver for nearly 15 years. Before Miami, there was Dubai. Before Dubai, there was Manila traffic, jeepneys, and a life where patience wasn't optional. It was survival. He sent money home every month, never missed. His mother's medication, his sister's tuition, his nephew's milk. He measured life and responsibilities, not dreams. That morning, the sun was already unforgiving. Miami heat clung to everything, including the tall glass tower where his newest employer lived. The building was the kind that smelled like money-clean marble, silent elevators, people who didn't look at you unless they needed something. Marco stood beside the car, hands clasped, eyes forward. Then came Richard Hawley. Richard walked like the ground owed him something. Designer sunglasses, tailored blazer, phone pressed to his ear, voice loud enough to announce his importance to strangers. He didn't acknowledge Marco at first, just tossed his keys without looking. Airport. And don't take the scenic route. Richard snapped. I'm already late. Marco caught the keys easily. Yes, sir. As soon as they were on the road, Richard started complaining. About traffic. About the humidity. About how Miami wasn't run like New York. His words were sharp, careless, thrown like spare change. You people drive so slow, Richard muttered, scrolling on his phone. I swear every time I get one of these. Foreign drivers. Marco kept his eyes on the road. I mean, no offense, Richard added without sincerity. But it's like you all learned to drive in chaos and bring it here. Marco didn't respond. That silence seemed to irritate Richard more than any argument could have. You hear me? He said. Or is English a second or third language for you? Marco tightened his grip on the steering wheel. I hear you, sir, Richard scoffed. Figures. They hit traffic near Brickell. Cars barely moved. Horns blared. The city breathed impatience. Richard slammed his phone down. Unbelievable. I'm paying you to get me there on time. Marco spoke calmly. There was an accident ahead, sir. GPS rerouting. Excuses, Richard snapped. You drivers are all the same. Replaceable. I could find 10 like you by lunch. The word landed hard. Replaceable. Marco swallowed. He had heard worse, much worse. He had learned long ago that dignity didn't always come with a paycheck. Sometimes survival meant letting insults pass through you like bad weather. But Richard wasn't done. You know, he continued, smirking, I don't get why people like you even come here. Low skills, low standards. Just happy to take orders. The car went quiet except for the hum of traffic. Marco didn't look at him, didn't argue, didn't defend himself. Richard laughed. Nothing to say? Of course. They arrived at the airport with seconds to spare. Richard jumped out, yanked his suitcase from the trunk, and paused just long enough to deliver one final remark. Try not to scratch the car. It costs more than you'll make in a year. Then he walked away without looking back. Marco stood there for a moment longer than necessary. He waited until Richard disappeared into the terminal before getting back into the driver's seat. Only then did he exhale. 3 days later, Marco received a call from the same building. Mr. Hawley requests you tomorrow morning, the concierge said. Marco nodded even though no one could see him. Yes, the next day felt heavier. He arrived early as always. Same silence, same keys tossed without eye contact. But something was different. Richard looked tired. Not the polished kind, something deeper. His phone rang constantly, but his confidence was cracked, just enough to notice. They drove toward a private medical facility this time. Halfway there, Richard finally spoke. You ever driven someone to a hospital before? He asked. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Good, Richard muttered, his voice sharp as broken glass. Because today better go smoothly. They pulled up to a discreet clinic, the kind of place where privacy was bought and sold. Richard got out without another word. A man encased in expensive armor. Marco waited. It was what he did best. Waiting was familiar, a comfortable silence in a life of servitude. An hour passed, then 2. He used the time to check messages from home, a world away. A photo from his sister flashed on the screen, a graduation cap, a smile so wide it could light up a room. His chest warmed with a quiet pride. Then his phone rang. Unknown number. "Hello?" Marco answered. "This is Dr. Klein." The voice on the other end said, "All business." "Are you Mr. Hale's driver?" "Yes. We need you to bring the car around. Immediately." The urgency in the doctor's tone was a cold premonition. When Richard came out, the armor was gone. His face was pale, stripped of its usual anger and arrogance. What was left was something raw, something human, fear. They drove in silence again, but this time it wasn't comfortable. It was heavy, suffocating. Richard's hands, usually so steady, shook as he stared out the window, looking at a city he owned but had never truly seen. Finally he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "They found something. Heart issue, genetic. Apparently, I've been ignoring symptoms for years." Marco kept his eyes on the road, his expression neutral. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir." Richard looked at him then, really looked at him, as if seeing the man in the driver's seat for the first time. "You ever been sick?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Scared?" "Yes." Richard swallowed hard. They reached his towering office building. He got out slowly, the usual storm of insults and sarcasm replaced by a profound exhaustion. That evening, Marco thought it was over. He'd find another employer, start another chapter in his quiet life, but the next day, the call came again. This time, Richard sat differently in the backseat. No phone, no sunglasses hiding his eyes. "Marco," he said suddenly. Marco glanced in the rearview mirror. "Yes, sir?" "How long you been driving?" 15 years. Richard nodded. "You're good at it." "Thank you." Another pause stretched between them. "You got family?" "Yes, in the Philippines." Richard stared at the city blurring past. "My father died young." "Same thing they're telling me now." "Heart." Marco didn't interrupt. He knew when to listen. "He had a driver too," Richard continued, his voice distant. "I barely remember the man's face, but I remember how he stayed calm when everything else fell apart." Something in the air of the car shifted. They arrived at a restaurant by the water, the sun glinting off the waves. Richard didn't get out right away. "Marco," he said, his voice lower. "I need you to drive me somewhere else after this." "Yes, sir. Somewhere personal." After lunch, Richard gave him an address. It wasn't a mansion or a penthouse. It was a modest house in a quiet, forgotten neighborhood. "This was my father's," Richard said as they pulled up. "I haven't been here in years." Inside, dust hung in the air like suspended memories. Richard walked slowly, touching the walls as if they might crumble and disappear. "He worked himself to death," Richard said, his voice hollow. "Thought money meant control." Marco listened, a silent witness. They stood in the living room, sunlight cutting through the dusty blinds, illuminating the past. "You know what's funny?" Richard said. "The only person who tried to slow him down was his driver." "A Filipino guy?" Marco's breath caught in his throat. Richard turned, his eyes searching Marco's face. "His name was, I think, Manuel." Marco's eyes widened just slightly. "That was my uncle." The room went still. The dust seemed to settle, and the world held its breath. "What?" Richard stared at him, bewildered. "My uncle Manuel," Marco said softly. "He worked as a driver in the U.S. years ago. He died here." Heart attack. Richard's face drained of all color. He looked like a ghost in his father's house. "He used to tell me stories," Marco continued, his voice steady, "about a rich man who never listened. But he stayed anyway, because his family back home depended on the job." Richard sank into a dusty armchair, the frame groaning under his weight. "That man was my father," he whispered. The silence that followed was heavy, undeniable, a bridge between two generations, two families connected by a tragedy they never knew they shared. Richard looked up slowly, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. All this time. And I talked to you like that. Marco didn't smile, he didn't gloat. He simply said, "Life is heavy, sir. People carry things you don't see." Richard buried his face in his hands. "I insulted you, treated you like you were nothing." Marco nodded. "You did," Richard's voice broke. "And your uncle—" "He tried to help my father." "Yes," Marco said. "Until his heart gave out too." They sat there for a long time, two men adrift in a sea of history. That evening, Richard didn't go home. He asked Marco to drive him to the hospital again. This time, when they arrived, Richard got out, then stopped and turned. "Marco?" "Yes?" "I don't know how to fix what I said, or how I've lived." Marco met his eyes in the mirror, his gaze unwavering. "You start by listening." Richard nodded. And he did. Weeks passed and things changed. The shouting stopped. The insults vanished. Richard started asking questions. He listened to the answers. He learned about Marco's life, the remittances sent home, the sacrifices made in silence. He learned about the family his own father's driver had left behind. One morning, Richard handed Marco an envelope. Inside wasn't just a raise. It was a contract for a partnership. It included healthcare, an education fund for Marco's family, and legal assistance for residency. "I don't need another driver," Richard said, his voice firm. "I need someone who tells me the truth." Marco didn't cry. He simply bowed his head in a gesture of profound gratitude. "Thank you,"